بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
All right. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Last week we read chapter 1 and 2. Our goal today is to read chapter 3 and 4. Chapter 1 pretty much covered the takeaway, I guess, from chapter 1 is the fact is that Islam is true, is not a cultural preference, but a fact. That was the main takeaway. We went over the differences between a preference and a fact. What is objective versus what is subjective. And we said that a fact is something universal, agreed upon, doesn't change based on context, time, culture, situation, no matter what. If you analyze it rationally and objectively, we should all come to the same outcome. And preference is subject to preference, subject to our own emotions, upbringing, culture, mood, personality, society. So many different factors play into what we prefer. And alhamdulillah, we have our preferences, that's fine. But it's important that we differentiate between the two. This is especially important with the modern world and this idea of relativism. God is what you want God to be. Truth is what you want it to be. Truth is different for every person, right? All of this is this idea of notion of what? There's no objective truth. It's relative. And as Muslims, we're like, no, right? As rational human beings, we're like, no, there are objective truths. And there are cultural, personal preferences. We don't mix up the two as being all the same. And so a lot of modern ideas are based on this idea that what? There is no objective truth, right? And that truth is what you want it to be, and it's pretty much a preference. And interestingly, another thing that this chapter 1 talks about is that Islam, when we say we have faith, there's a difference. I guess the author made a distinction between blind faith, faith with the idea of just submitting, surrendering to a greater power, right? For the sake of finding purpose, right? And that's we see that at least in in Christian media, right? Like when they talk about faith, it's like, why do you have faith? Well, I just have faith. It doesn't have to make sense. Faith is supposed to be something greater than me. It's supposed to give me meaning, purpose. It isn't evidence-based. It isn't a rational conclusion that I've come to. And that is where us as Muslims were like, no, faith is evidence-based. And it is a rational conclusion that you can come to. It doesn't mean that you just believe for the sake of having some meaning in life. It doesn't matter what that meaning is. Your faith could be, you believe in this, or you believe in that, or you believe in your ancestors, or you believe in just spirituality, you believe in kindness to everyone as your religion. That's a preference. It's not, that's blind faith. You want to just make that your faith, that's fine, but it's blind faith. It isn't based on some type of objective rationale. Whereas Muslims are like, no, Islam is true, and we can prove that objectively. It makes sense from its beliefs to, and that's the most important part. We're saying primarily believing in Allah, the Messenger, and the last day, that these three facts can be proven objectively. We're not Muslims just because we want to be Muslims, or we shouldn't be Muslims just because we were born a Muslim, or just because it feels good to be a Muslim. Islam gives me meaning, right? That isn't our tradition. A lot of Muslims have that, but that is not the approach that Islam actually teaches us. Islam criticizes this approach. When it is told to them, follow what God has revealed, they say, we follow what our ancestors used to do, right? And so Islam criticizes this approach, that you're simply adopting beliefs based on what? Tradition, ancestry, culture, feeling good, right? It gives me meaning. No. Right? Even worshiping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's not about feeling good. Worshiping Allah is because Allah deserves to be worshipped. The feeling good part is a benefit of that worship. Right? We're not worshiping Allah because, when I worship Allah and I pray, it brings me meaning and purpose and so on. That's great, right? But is that the reason we worship Allah? So if you don't experience pleasure and happiness in your ibadah and you're not, right, experiencing this spiritual high, Are you going to say like, well, why am I even praying? There's no delight in my salah. I don't feel anything when I pray. Well, you're not praying for yourself. You're praying because your Lord deserves to be worshipped. That is why you're praying. Amma, you enjoying the salah, that's the fruit of your work that Allah has granted you. And Allah might not grant it to you. It might be a test that sometimes He tests you to see, are you worshiping Him for your own self-benefit? Or are you worshiping Him because your Lord deserves to be worshipped? Right? That itself is a spiritual journey and a realization that we go through. And so the author here is making this clear distinction that our faith isn't because of what we like, what we want, our preference, how it makes us feel, and all of these other things which are praiseworthy and fine. But no, it's based on objective truths, rational, sound reasons that make sense, that are objectively, that are factual, and that is why we worship Allah. We worship Allah, why? Because there's no true God except God. There's only one true God. He is our Lord, provider, sustainer, creator, maker, nourisher, and therefore we love Him. We appreciate Him. We're grateful to Him. We know we don't accept any deity besides Him. We devote ourselves to Him because He deserves that. He has the right to have that. And so we submit ourselves to Him. And then afterwards, when you do this, you are liberated. You experience the delight of faith. You experience the sweetness of Iman. You experience, your conscience is clear. You have clear morals and ethics. These are the benefits of your worship, but they're not the objectives of your worship. Is that clear? Right? Making this distinction is very clear because we find that today religion is pretty much defined as something that brings you good feelings, meaning and purpose, and that isn't our primary reason for why we worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the chapter 1 kind of goes a little bit, covers some of these topics. And then the second chapter, he talks about who is God according to the Quran. We covered the privative attributes of God. We established that God, he says here, the God who is described in the Quran is the necessary being who has volitional agency and is characterized by the attributes of speech, hearing, and sight. And so we talked about that a bit. Inshallah, we'll talk about that a bit more as we continue. And then when we talked about the attributes of speech, hearing, and sight, we said that God's attributes are unlike His creation. Right? So we know that God's hearing is different than His knowledge. But how is that different? Right? What does that entail? How does it work? We can't comprehend. We can't comprehend the reality of God and His attributes. And that is why there's that principle that we don't make comparisons when we speak about God. We take it as is and we believe in it, but we don't delve into the specifics of it. Right? And so that is a principle that Ahlul Sunnah have adopted. Interestingly, a friend of mine who I was sitting with was listening to this rebuttal from a Muslim brother, and there was a back and forth rebuttal about Ahlul Sunnah and their belief in the names and attributes of God. And the brother was saying, like, God speaks, and we know that He speaks, and He has a voice, and this other person denies that. And the brother made a critical mistake. God speaks, yes. He has a voice, no. Voice is a quality of creation. Right? And so a lot of Muslims fall into this comparison. Even Muslims do this. People have fallen into anthropomorphism where they're trying to describe God as creation. No. When they speak about God moving as if He's moving from space to space, no. God isn't matter for Him to move from space to space. So what is the essence of God? We don't know. We affirm His qualities as is. That He, subhanahu wa ta'ala, speaks. But is that speech voice and sounds and sound waves that... No, that is not like that. Right? Because we know that's how creation communicates. And God is different from His creation. So what is the reality of God's speech? We cannot fathom that reality. We don't delve into it. Right? And so that's a clear distinction. Even Ahlul Sunnah oftentimes, many who claim to be Ahlul Sunnah, when they're speaking about these issues, they really say some really problematic statements. Right? Somebody said, God has a hand, but I don't know what kind of hand He has. It could be this type of hand or that type of hand. I'm like, that statement is already problematic, right? Because you're already imagining that God is some type of material being made of mass and takes up space. And no, that is not the position of Ahl-Sunnah. That we do not compare God to creation. He is above His creation. And that's what Sayyidina Abu Bakr, he said, whatever your mind imagines God to be, know that He is beyond that, right? كُلُّ مَا خَطَرَ فِي بَالِكَ وَاللَّهُ خِلَافُ ذَلِكَ. Everything that occurs in your mind, any imagination that no, God is beyond that, Allah is different than that. And so that's the principle of Ahl-Sunnah that we adopt, and there's been a lot of back and forths about the technicalities of what terminologies Ahl-Sunnah uses. We have another one here today. Hey, mashallah. Assalamu alaikum. Mashallah. So this is just to make an important clarification on this issue. We've seen even those of Ahl-Sunnah make this mistake. Those who adhere to the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ and the way of the predecessors, making these claims that are very problematic and very incorrect to say about God. And so he spoke a little bit about that. We got into some of the qualities of God, and we clarified what we mean by God when we speak about God in Islam. And so that's just a recap of chapter 1 and 2. In lesson 1 and 2, we covered the fitrah, which is a very important lesson. So for those of you who are joining us for the first time, I highly recommend listening to lecture 1 and 2, inshallah ta'ala, on the issue of the topic of the fitrah. That is everything, or roughly what we've covered. Inshallah, we'll move on to chapter 3. Any questions before we start chapter 3? No, so the discussion questions are recommended, right? I encourage everyone to kind of write, a response to those questions and see if you can, if you're able to respond to them on your own, right? It's important. A lot of Muslims, they depend on imams, to kind of provide them the information. I want you guys to be critical thinkers, right? And you don't need me to quote every verse for you and every rationale, right? You critically think about this and be like, hey, I can answer this, right? I can, if I can't make sense of it, let me read it a second time so I can make sense of it. Because you will all be teachers in some capacity. You are teachers to your families. You are teachers to your children, inshallah, for those of you who have children. And you are teachers to maybe new Muslims. You are teachers to others, right? You are teachers to non-Muslims. So I want you all to be process this information, look at the discussion questions, and be like, hey, can I respond to this, right? Can I think critically enough that I can provide an answer to these questions? And so, no, we're not going to discuss them. That's just an activity for you to do after class, inshallah ta'ala. All right, let's get into the chapter 3. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. The author, Barakallahu fihi wa hafidhahullah, he says, as the tradition of our ulama is to always make dua for the author. Because he has given us a favor, right? We are indebted to him. He has compiled this knowledge and made it available for us. And so may Allah Ta'ala reward him on our behalf and bless him and preserve him. Chapter 3, fact. The contingency of the universe is evidence for God's existence. So the fact here is what? First of all, the big word contingency. What does contingency mean? Right? So just highlight that word. Important to know what that word is. And then the second is the contingency of the universe is evidence, right? It leads us to God. So the universe leads us to God. And so that's the kind of the main concept of the chapter. Inshallah, we'll start our reading. He says, what is the proof that God exists? If someone came up to you and asked you how you know that God exists, what would you say? Perhaps you would answer that you know God exists because He created you. Or perhaps you might point out the vastness of the universe or the beauty of nature and tell them that only God could have created it. You would be on the right track with both of these answers, but you haven't organized your reasons as well as you could have. Right, so here's just a clarity on argument and concept, right? A better way to organize your reasons is to list a collection of carefully worded facts and then clearly state what those facts entail. Here is an example. This way of organizing your reason is called a logical proof. We will learn the details of this logical proof in the rest of this chapter. Fact 1, the universe exists contingently. Fact 2, everything that exists contingently needs a necessary being to make it exist. Therefore, the universe needs a necessary being to make it exist. We're going to go over each fact one by one, but I just want you guys to look at the process. So you have a fact, you have another fact, and then you have a conclusion, right? Fact 1, the universe exists contingently. Fact 2, everything that exists contingently needs a necessary being to make it exist. Therefore, the universe needs a necessary being to make it exist. This proof, first of all, this logical proof is a concept that like people, philosophers use, rhetoric, people who are like in like, even lawyers, they study a lot of this stuff, because it's like a lot of like this like rational thinking, right? And so here's this evidence, we have this evidence, therefore this is the outcome, right? Like if you're a lawyer or you study law, like this is like how they think. It's very like, just I don't know, very plain, concrete, approach to things. This proof is called the argument from contingency. It is found throughout the Quran. So this is an important here, fact that he mentioned. This isn't just some rational philosophical argument, but he said this is based in the Quran. Right? This is based on the Quran. There are many other proofs for the existence of God. Maybe you have heard of these proofs. Maybe you haven't heard of these proofs. We will not be studying these other proofs for the existence of God in this book because most of them are not good proofs and none of them are taught in the Quran. There are many, many, more than even what he mentions. But we're going to take some of the most used arguments in the Quran and those that are very self-evident. We will focus on learning the argument from contingency. This phrase is going to come up again and again and again and again. Argument from contingency. And to a lesser degree, on the kalam, cosmological argument. And so kalam, we said that is theology, right? Islamic theology, the science of Islamic theology is called kalam, or at least speculative or rational theology, right? It's based on rationale. Kalam is the science of rational Islamic theology. So the kalam, cosmological argument, we're going to get into these two arguments, inshallah. Both of these arguments are clear, conclusive, and taught in the Quran. In order to understand these arguments, you have to first understand what it means for the universe to be contingent. So far, how are we doing so far? Okay? Not too bad? Concepts are clear? All right, let's get through the rest. Fact 1. The universe, Zoom folks, if you have any questions or you need me to clarify anything, please let me know. Fact 1, the universe exists contingently. Contingency is a very simple concept. Something is contingent if it could have been some other way. Highlight that, underline that, know that definition. Contingency means something is contingent if it could have been some other way. That is what it means for an object to be contingent. He's going to elaborate on that for about more than 2 pages. If you understand that concept, you got fact 1 down. So we're going to go and just speak about that for a little bit more. If we observe all the things around us, we clearly see that they don't have to be the way that they are. We grasp this intuitively as we examine the universe. But we can also infer it from the fact that everything is changing. So here he mentioned something interesting, and I want all of us just to be mindful of this. Sounds good. Jazakallah khair, Ismail. Fuad, did you have a question?
You want to exit this one? No, I don't.
Okay. So number 1, he says we grasp this intuitively. One of the things about just, I guess, studying anything in depth, they really dissect intuitive knowledge in a way that is very complex, right? If you studied philosophy, or just, I don't know, a lot of like rationale concepts, even like psychology, a lot of the stuff they study is like stuff like, oh, that's common sense. We already know that. But they're over here like doing like this full-on essay, right, study, like writing down and explaining it and really dissecting it little by little, piece by piece. And you're like, yeah, I know this. Like if you're a parent and you like study, you're like, yeah, I know, like this is like common sense. If you have a kid, you know this stuff, right? You don't need anybody to lecture you about it. But this is the journey of like intellectual work, right? So when we're doing intellectual work and we're studying, we really look at these simple concepts that we know intuitively, and we really try to dissect them and grasp them on a more conscious level, right? You know it subconsciously, like you know it without even thinking. Like, I know this stuff, right? But right now, we're trying to process it consciously. Really think about it and understand how this works. Is that clear? So I want everybody to just, bear with me as we go through these concepts, because some of them might be like, oh, this is very simple. I know this. Like, there's no reason to kind of go over this in this depth. And then the second thing he says, we can also infer it from the fact that everything is changing. And this is the conscious part, right? You're actually reflecting on this simple concept and you're really thinking about it. How can I come to a conclusion, a conscious conclusion on this matter that I know intuitively? Does that make sense? How can I come to a conscious conclusion on this matter that I know intuitively? I think a good example of that is when you know something is wrong. Somebody did something to you, and you're just like, that was wrong. But you're just not able to articulate yourself on why that was wrong. Intuitively, you know whatever this person did was wrong. But you need a moment to think about it, to consciously process what happened, dissect it, and be like, oh, this is where it happened. Right? They did it in this manner, or they said it in this way, or there was this tone or attitude with how they said it, and I know that was not appropriate. Right? And so that's the difference between your intuition versus your conscious. Your intuition, Allah has given it, it's a gift. SubhanAllah, the intuition is one of the most remarkable things in reality. Right? For me, it blows my mind away. That our intuition is a mind of its own. It's a genius on its own. The mathematics we do when we take steps is really insane. How we precisely determine where the step is and how much weight we put and how much we control. All of that is intuitive, but it's really complex mathematics. If you try to create a robot to do that, it would take a lot of engineering. And that's just like intuitive. The kid knows it. Like, they're a toddler and they're already learning how to walk and they're running and they learn how to go upstairs. And all of this is like intuitive, complex mathematics that's happening in the brain, right? Intuition is amazing. It's a gift from Allah. How we drive, right? All this stuff, like you just do it after a while and you just know it. And you're doing complex mathematics, and we see drivers of really great skill, like how they're able to determine how close to get to a car by an inch, a couple of inches, right? Like you see some people are really gifted with certain intuition in certain matters. It's amazing, right? And so a lot of things we know intuitively. And then other things, and part of the learning process is to practice what we know intuitively consciously, to bring it to mind and to really take it apart and really try to understand it piece by piece by piece, right? And that is allowing you to process what you know on a more conscious level, right? And you become a lot more appreciative of what you know intuitively. And so that's something I just wanted to share as a side note, I guess. But let's move on. All right, this idea of things being contingent. Things in the universe are contingent. He said, take the moon, for example. Every month, it appears as a crescent, grows into a half moon, a waxing gibbous, and then a full moon. And then it shrinks back into a waning gibbous, a half moon, and a crescent, and it finally disappears. The changes in these regular phases highlight their contingency. What does that mean? Since the moon actually appears in all of these different phases, it doesn't have to appear in any of them. This means that none of these phases are necessary, and that it is another way of saying that all of these phases are contingent. Whenever the moon appears in one phase, it could have also appeared in another phase. It could have been some other way. That's what it means for it to be contingent. Who understands that? Who's like, I got this, it makes sense. No, I got a couple people.
Could you elaborate that a little bit?
All right. So here he uses the example of the moon, right? The moon, he says there are four stages of the moon. As we know, the moon starts out as a small crescent, right? And then we call that a crescent, right? And then it grows into a half moon. And then you have a waxing gibbous, I guess, which is like 2/3 of a moon. And then you have a full moon, middle of the month, right? You have a full moon for 3 days. And then you get the opposite, right? You get a waning gibbous, a half moon, and then a crescent, and then it goes away completely, and the cycle repeats every month. Make sense? Right. He's saying the moon doesn't have to be either of these ways. It could have been a full moon the entire time. It could have been a waxing gibbous the entire time. It could have been a crescent the entire time. Like is it possible rationally for these things, for the moon to be one way or another? Is it possible? It is. It could have been. There's nothing to say that it is impossible, right, for the moon to be some other way. That is what he's saying. It's contingent. It could have been some other way. Another easier concept. The moon is a bit complex. Let's say us. We could have been born the year we were born, to the parents we were born, to the families we were born, with the personalities and the genetics we were born. Or we could have been born different. We could have been born a male or female, depending on X or Y chromosome. We could have been born with certain temperaments, depending on genetics. We could have been born at certain times. Right? Like, we didn't have to be, like, I don't have to be the way I am. I could have been, who knows, right? An infinite number of possibilities for who I could have been, when I could have been, who I would have been born to, right? Like, there's nothing rational to say that Abdullahi has to be born to this family and he has to be in this way. It is impossible. Rationally, I can't conceive the idea that he would have been different than what he is today. Does that make sense? That is so. Everything pretty much in the universe is like that. It could have been any other way. There's nothing to say objectively it's impossible. Yes?
So it just takes the aspect of being impossible away?
Pretty much. So he's saying it's not impossible for it to be different. Yes, so that's very accurate. Now, an important distinction that has to be made here: what is customarily impossible versus what is rationally impossible. I want you guys to know those two differences, to note that, okay? What is customarily impossible versus what is rationally impossible are two different things. Customarily impossible is things, laws of nature that we know, that this is how things work. It is impossible based on what we've observed in nature for it to be otherwise. What is something that is customarily impossible?
Human beings flying.
Human beings flying. Right? You don't see that. We've never seen that. I mean, unless you're watching fantasy, right? Shows or right, with some human being with wings or something, right? But customarily, like, we've never had a human being fly. Let's take this example, right? Customarily, human beings don't fly. It's impossible. Human beings cannot. But is that actually rationally impossible? Is it like completely impossible rationally to imagine a human being that could fly? No. We could all imagine a human being that can fly. So rationally, it's not impossible, right? Rationally, it's not impossible. In Arabic, they call this mustahil aqli, mustahil adi, right? This is impossible based on like custom, tradition, what we've observed in the world. We're like, no, it can't be, right? And that is how we act in the world. But when we think rational, the rationale is greater than what we observe in the world, right? So we have to think rationally. Is it rationally impossible? No, it's not. Human beings could have wings and fly. Why not? They can fly with some supernatural power that they have inside of them. Why not? Right? It's not impossible. It can happen, right? If God gave them the will and the power, it could happen, right? Maybe gene editing, some crazy gene editing, I don't know, a million years from now they came up with something to create wings for human beings or something. Who knows? Maybe, right? But it's not like rationally impossible, although it's customarily impossible. So these two concepts are important to differentiate. So right now we're talking rational. We're not talking about what is like normal in the world. Is that clear? How about now? How do you guys feel now? Does this concept make sense? What is?
Is it like Maryam giving birth to Isa?
Right, and that is what we call a miracle.
Yeah.
A miracle is something that breaks the laws of nature. It isn't rationally impossible, right? Like we're like, oh yeah, okay, God could have made it. Human being born without a father, yeah. But customarily, it's impossible. If somebody came today and like, I have a baby and it's born without a father, you're like, oh, no, that's not how it works, right? So customarily, it's impossible, right? But rationally, it is. And we can accept that exception if there's revelation to confirm it, right? If God said, I've done this, then we can accept it. Or we could even accept sometimes, if we observe it in reality, something superordinary happens, something supernatural, right? We're like, okay, this is not normal based on our laws of nature, but supernatural events can happen, and there have been records of supernatural events happening throughout all human societies. Through dark magic be it, through some miracle be it, whatever we want to call it. There have been some records of that. So it's not that it's rationally it's impossible, just customarily it's impossible. So that is a good example, yes. And when something breaks that norm, we call it a miracle. How are we doing so far? Is this concept clear now? So contingent means it could have been some other way. And pretty much everything is contingent, right? Literally everything you can think of, the stars, the moon, the galaxy, the different planets, the different stars, right? Our solar system, me and you, this computer, this book, this pen, all of it is contingent. It could have been any way. Is that clear? Right.
This kind of shows like Allah's what do you call it, the volitional agency as well. But it kind of proves that point.
Exactly, that's the point he's making. He's saying that all of these things could have been any other way, so something had to make them this way. Do you see what I'm saying? So that's the whole argument. All of the universe is contingent, so therefore there has to be a being that made them this way. That's the whole argument, right? So that, and that is why, it's like I said, very strong argument. What made the world the way it is? Are you saying random chance of all of these events happening? No. I mean, the randomness is one problem in it. That's one aspect of it. But the fact that you're saying events happened without a doer. How is that possible? Life happened without a maker. Life had to happen. Things had to change, take place, form, whatever, evolve, without anybody making it do that. So how did it have will? So not inanimate objects have a will of their own to do things? You see what I'm saying? Like, it's not possible. You can't have, things be without. And they're all contingent. They could have been so many ways without there being a maker to make them be the way they are. How are we feeling so far about this concept? Who feels like, I got this, it makes sense, we can move on?
It's intuitive.
It is intuitive, but just kind of raise your hand. I want to know, who feels like, I got this, it makes sense, we can move on? Who would like a little bit more commentary? No? Another?
So
You have a question?
does that, with that logic, it makes Allah not contingent?
Exactly. By that logic, Allah is non-contingent. He can't be contingent. Because if he's contingent, then we go into this problem of what? Infinite creators. Then who made God? Then who made God? Then who made that God? And it's infinite creators, which is also impossible. Rationally, we can't accept the infinite events. And he's going to bring up this example of, let's say you heard a rumor by yourself. I'm going to use myself here. Somebody said, Abdullah is, always sleeping in class, right? And then Like, I asked Sam said, well, I heard it from Warfa. Like, I'm asking, knowing intuitively there had to be somebody who originated it. And that person did it of their own accord. There has to be an original event, an original doer or causer, right? So we're going to get to that, right? But there has to be an original event that started this chain of events. And so Allah is a necessary being who has no beginning. And that person has to have volitional agency, right? They can't have been made to do it, right? Otherwise, they're just one part of the equation, right? And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He is that, the term we use is necessary being. He has to be. And He has to be uncaused, subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is a concept we can't fathom. Because everything we know in the universe is defined by time, space, and matter. So what is a being beyond space, beyond time, beyond matter? We can't fathom that. Right? And that is what we say, subhanallah. Allah's perfection is beyond my comprehension. Allah's azamah, His greatness is beyond me. No matter how much I try to think about it, I can't. And that's what the Prophet ﷺ, when he was questioned, a man, we have thoughts, he said, like, one of you, the shaitan will come and say, who created Allah, who created Allah? The Prophet said, let him stop. Right? Just stop, because you can't continue. Submit, you know that there's God, there's no God but He, all the signs are there. Beyond that, you can't fathom the reality of God. Right? You submit at that point. You have to stop. You can't. Your mind is trying to reach a world and a reality that you can't fathom. You can't begin to fathom. Is that, yeah? We got into this is actually a little premature. We're supposed to get into that later, but I'm just getting into it for the sake of, the lesson. Our brother Adnan, you have a question?
Yeah. Maybe I'm too much of a literalist, but the word, to me, contingent means depending on something, right? Certain conditions are met, something happens. For example, it's the moon. A little bizarre. I think it's a little easier to swallow if you're saying cause and effect, maybe. Like, the effect of some, is that something is changing. Well, what's the cause of it?
Right.
To me, that's what contingent, like, I will do this contingent that you do X, Y, Z.
Okay. Yeah, I hear that. And that is what I understood the word, like, from just a linguistic perspective. But I think when they were like, I think that's correct. Actually, I won't even, I think that's correct. The brother Adnan, he said that when he thinks of the word contingent, he thinks of it as a cause and effect, right? When you say something is contingent on this other thing, like it depends on this other thing for it to happen, right? So it's an effect of another object, right? So this thing is contingent, right, on whatever. I'll do your homework on, on contingency that you clean my room or something, right? Like I'll do this on this cause that you do that, right? So that does make sense. And so that is another way that this moon, right, for it to have the phases it has, like somebody had to make it, right? It's contingent. It depends on a maker to have caused it to be the way it is. Now, when we say this, we're taking out all the creation in the process, right? If you're saying the orbit of the sun and the moon and the earth and how everything is orbiting around each other, and we're going beyond the natural process. We're saying who even made the natural process for the moon to appear the way it did. Does that make sense? We're going beyond nature and saying even nature, who made that? The nature itself is contingent. That's why there's a book by a Turkish author. I forgot his name. He was a big scholar during the early 20th century. Rahimahullah, I can't recall the name, but he wrote a book, Cause, Nature. He said, nature, cause or effect. For us, nature is just an effect. Right? Nature it's a system of laws. It's a system of natural laws. It's not an intelligent, volitional being as, right, mushriks try to describe it, right? Like nature is Mother Nature. There's this intelligent, volitional creator being that's making, no. Nature is just a system. It's itself a contingent being. All these laws are contingent. Cause is God. And that's why in Islam we said the true doer is only Allah. Allah is the only unobjectively true doer. Everything else is just relatively doing something. Right? We're taking what Allah has given us, we're Taking the energy, this talking, the speech, the thoughts, all of this is Allah's making do this, right? It's His doing, subhanahu wa ta'ala. I'm just an instrument that Allah gave a free will, and I work within that, the system that Allah has created, and that Allah is the one that He's making constantly, subhanahu wa ta'ala. Does that make sense, right? So I like Brother Adnan, what you mentioned, right? Cause and effect. Everything in the universe is an effect. And the effect, I guess, with the contingency is to say that it could have been affected to be any way or form or how. That's what it means, contingent, right? So we have the linguistic approach, and then we have the kind of the technical definition here based on the term here. In Arabic, they say hadith or mutaghayyir, right? They say this is mutaghayyir, something that can change and be different. And Allah is not mutaghayyir, Allah is not hadith. He's not made, He's not an effect, He's not changing. He's da'im, subhanahu wa ta'ala. He's always. And that is why Allah doesn't change. Right? Part of our creed is what? Allah doesn't change. He doesn't sleep. He doesn't get tired. That's all part of the similarity that mushriks made, right? Even like Christians, God rested on the seventh, right? They compared God to creation, that God gets tired, His energy or power gets depleted and must be restored. No. God is beyond creation. He doesn't change. He always is. That is what it means to be non-contingent. Non-contingent means there's no change. You're necessary. You are as you are always. Does that make sense? So just some clarification, I guess, there. Yeah.
Why, I still, all my life, I've been trying to figure out why this man tries so hard, though, to like twist it and figure out. I understand I see what it's saying, but it's saying it's still leading me back to the same beginning. Like, if it's intuitive, though, you know what I'm saying? Why does man try so hard to figure out?
I think it's the process of just knowledge. The process of knowledge is to learn things consciously. Curiosity is one. Most people, they know this stuff intuitively. They're like, I don't need this. I remember there was a story. Yeah, the sister mentioned a good point. They're like, why do people get into these even complex philosophical arguments? Like, this is intuitive. Like, why are we having a whole concept about explaining contingency, right? Like, it's intuitive.
Psychology class. It don't make no sense.
No, I mean, that's going a bit further, further than what I wanted to say. But yeah, intellectual curiosity leads to investigating simple concepts. Right? That's just intellectual curiosity. But if you don't have it, you don't have to. Right? One woman, there was a story like Imam Razi, rahimahullah, one of the greatest Islamic theologians and scholars in history. He was once visiting a town, and the scholars were the celebrities of the ummah of the past. Like when a scholar went to a town, they would the masjid would be like a stadium. You would go to the largest mosque, the entire town, everything would stop to sit with that scholar and listen from him, right? We see how much the values of society has changed, right? Today, a scholar comes, who's going, right? But a music artist goes, the lines are beginning to the, right, next block, right, or miles block, right? So may Allah guide us all. But Imam al-Razi, he was this great scholar, right? He came to this town. And, all these people are like, oh, Imam al-Razi, we're going to go. And then they're like, why? What's so special? They're like, he's a man who knows who knows 1,000 proofs, about God. And she said, why does he need 1,000 proofs? Does he have 1,000 doubts? She's an old woman, right? But she's like knowledge of God is intuitive. I don't need all these complex arguments, right? She's like, khalas, I have yaqeen, no doubt. There's no God except Allah. I know this absolute certainty. I don't need all these 1,000 rational arguments to convince me. Does that make sense? So yes, that's very true. But I will add to that, it's also important to process these concepts, because to process what we believe in intellectually is a command of the Quran. Right? The Quran calls us. Look at the signs of God. Did anyone create this besides God? Right? The Quran is calling us to reflect. So the Quran does want us to reflect on what we know intuitively on a deeper sense. Right? So it is a command of the Quran. It also leads to deeper conviction. Right? Intuition is great, but when you understand this now rationally, your aql and your fitrah are completely in sync. Your conviction becomes now what? Even greater, because it's conviction, intuitive conviction, and also conscious conviction. Right? And so now your belief is even greater. You're worshiping Allah now with even a greater sense of like certainty. You have yaqeen, like you want to attain this level of certainty, right? You reach the state of yaqeen. Right? And so that is what the process of consciously processing this information versus the intuition, inshallah, grants us. And the third part to this equation is applying this knowledge through ihsan. Because you can't appreciate faith if you don't apply it spiritually. Where you're standing before God and you're reflecting, and that's why Allah commands us, like, لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَفَكَّرُونَ, so that you may think, right? Yet أَفَلَا يَدَّبَّرُونَ, like, do they not reflect, right? تَعْقِلُونَ, like, the message of the Quran is to reflect, to think, to really look, right? When I was talking about like taking a step, right, or like the complex mathematics that's in just taking a step, walking up a flight of stairs. There's so much complex mathematics. Like, do you not see the wonders of Allah in that? Allah says, فَلْيَنظُرِ الْإِنسَانُ إِلَىٰ طَعَامِهِ. Let the human being look at his meal. Look at just the meal, the burger, whatever. We have some samosas and rice coming tonight, and I don't know what we have, but you know, that meal, if you take a moment just to wonder at the marvel creation of Allah, like, it blows your mind. This grain of rice and how it grew and the process of rain and sun, and like, it's just, how great is the one who made all this? Subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? So we're commanded to think about this on a conscious level, on a spiritual level, to invoke emotions of love, gratitude, appreciation, right? And once you start having that, and it all syncs, your spirit, your mind, your intuition, and now you start to experience the delight of faith. And faith becomes more dear to you than any treasure in the world. And you have the force by which you can conquer any problem. No matter what you're going through. You can go through death, and death will be insignificant in light of the faith that you have in your heart. Because you have a conviction and a reality you have come to, like, all of this is just a mirage. It's just theatrics. Reality is Allah, that's all that matters, and His pleasure and acceptance. And if I got that, what else matters, right? But that's a conviction that's not easy to attain. It takes time, it takes intellectual development, it takes spiritual, that's the hard part. The spiritual development to really connect with God on an emotional level, right? And that's the journey of ihsan, the journey of becoming excellent in our worship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, so we sidetracked. We're going to go back. We're 7:33. I would love to give you guys a break. How are we feeling? Break time, 5-minute break, and then resume after. We're supposed to do 2 chapters. We haven't even gone halfway through 1 chapter, so it's okay. We'll see what we need to do later. But let's take a 5-minute break, or 6-minute break. We'll resume again at 7:40, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair wa barakallahu feekum. Yeah. Assalamu alaikum. Is it here? The brother asked me about that author I was mentioning who wrote the book Nature, Cause or Effect. His name is Badi'u Zaman, Saeed Nursi. He's like his title is like the wonder of his time. Like, he was like an intellectual giant. He was in prison for a large portion of his time because of the ruling party at that time. I think they were communist and anti-religion. He was in Turkey at his time. And so he wrote some great writings. I think I was listening to a podcast a while back. One of the Muslim, I guess, professors or PhD student, he did his whole PhD thesis on his writings, on the belief in Allah, God, and doubts, and because communism, right, rejects the belief in the idea of belief in God and religion. So Saeed Nursi, he was combating this issue. So he wrote a lot of books that address this issue. And so one of his books was Nature, Cause or Effect, right? Is nature a creation or a creator? What is it, right? And he like, and his writings are so eloquent, and it's available all in English. He has over, maybe a couple dozen books that have been translated. But just a genius, a real wonder, rahimahullah ta'ala. So I would recommend a good author whose works to read is his, especially looking at during World War II and I as well. If you're looking at communism, refutation of atheism, a lot of those issues that were happening at that time, he really wrote some amazing work. I have some of his books in my collection here. But yeah, so check his work out if you like reading. I definitely recommend his stuff. Rahimahullah ta'ala. All right, let's continue. So, Saeed, S-A-I-D, Nursi, N-U-R-S-I. I was just Googling his life. He was born in 1877, passed away March 23rd, 1960. Rahimahullah. Yeah. It looks like they actually have photos of him. Yeah, so. So he's somebody worth checking out, inshallah. Rahmatullah alayh. All right, let's continue. We are on the third paragraph of page 24. He says, regarding this concept of contingency, the same is true of everything else in the universe. We grasp it intuitively that everything else in the universe could have been some other way, and our intuitive understanding is then confirmed by the changes that we observe. That is why we search for scientific explanations for the way things are, for the way that things are. The moon is contingent, and this is an important clarification that he makes. He says the moon is contingent and needs something to make it shine, so we search for a scientific explanation of why it shines. The sky is contingent and needs something to make it blue, so we search for a scientific explanation of why it's blue. Everything in the universe is contingent and needs something to make it the way that it is. That is why we search for scientific explanations for everything in the universe. If the things in the universe weren't contingent, we wouldn't search for any scientific explanations at all. We would simply say that they have to be the way that they are. They could have not been otherwise. And that they before don't need to be explained and should just be accepted as brute facts. But that is not how we experience the universe. Everything that exists in the universe is contingent. The universe exists contingently. So here, right, he's showing us that we all know everything is contingent. That is what we're like, well, why does the moon do this? And why does the sun do that? And why do the cell react? Like, we know there is a cause, right? Things, like, we're not just, it is the way it is. No, like there's a reason, right? We know it intuitively that there's a reason, right? As I said, this is very intuitive knowledge. We all know that things are contingent, right? He's just helping further clarify that through this, right? His writing. Now, fact 2, we said, everything that exists contingently. We established that, right? Fact 1 is what? Everything exists what? Contingently. Fact 2 is, all these things that exist contingently need a necessary being to make it exist. Right, so that's where we're getting to. They all need a necessary being. The truth of the first fact above was obvious and straightforward. Even though everyone might not say it, we all accept that the universe is contingent. Otherwise, we would simply say that everything is a brute fact and not search for any scientific explanations. The truth of the second fact, however, needs to be demonstrated in more detail. The second fact states that the existence of contingent things can only be explained by the existence of something that is not contingent. That is the definition of the second fact, right? Highlight that, underline that, whatever you need. We call that non-contingent thing a necessary being. Right? If this thing that is the cause of everything is non-contingent, what would be the proper term for that? It would be, subhanahu wa ta'ala, it would be necessary being. He has to be the way that he is. He could not have been any other way. In order to understand why no contingent thing can explain another contingent thing, we need to first understand what it means to explain something else. In the context of the argument from contingency, it means to make something the way that it is. So, when we say that no contingent thing, here he goes on to deal with like, keep up, do your best. Inshallah, if you get lost, I'm going to summarize it. Don't worry too much about it. All right, let me start over. In order to understand why no contingent thing can explain another contingent thing, we need to first understand what it means to explain something else. So what does it mean to explain something? That's one. In the context of the argument from contingency, it means, right, what does it mean here? Meaning to explain something. It means to make something the way that it is. That is the explanation, right? To make something the way that it is. So when we say that no contingent thing can explain another contingent thing, we are saying that no contingent thing can make another contingent thing the way that it is. If you got that, you got it. If you don't, move on. Don't worry about it. I know it's a lot. It's a lot. It's like you're running. It's a lot. Don't worry about it. Let's move on. He's going to give us an example which is going to make everything easy. Okay. Let's take the example of the moon again. There needs to be a reason why the moon is a crescent. Why it is a half moon? Why it is a gibbous? Why it is a full moon? And why it disappears. Another way of saying this is that each of these different phases needs something to make it the way it is. There has to be some type of observable cause, right? Some type of rational, not necessarily observable, but some type of rational cause that made this thing happen. A scientific explanation will explain these different phases in terms of other contingent things in the universe, right? That's what science does. Science explains things based on the natural world, right? So it will say that the phases of the moon are a result of the earth obstructing the light of the sun. Right, so here we're talking a little bit about astrology, right? So the phases of the moon.
Back on Zoom.
Oh my God, the brother is. I didn't unmute myself on the Zoom. Okay, brothers, I apologize. For those of you on Zoom, we're over here on a roll, and I forgot to unmute myself.
We saw you on the YouTube. We're like, oh, okay.
Yeah, my apologies. I got the Zoom, I got the YouTube, I got meals tonight, so my apologies. All right. For the portion that you missed, check out the YouTube recording, inshallah. But you're going to get to the good part. The good part is coming up right now to kind of explain things. Here he says, we're on the middle of page 225, all right? On the fifth paragraph. Third paragraph from the bottom. A scientific explanation will explain these different phases in terms of other contingent things in the universe. It will say that the phases of the moon are a result of the earth obstructing the light of the sun. Right? So you have the sun, the earth is blocking some of its light, that light out. As the sun shines from behind the earth onto the moon, the earth prevents some of its light from reaching the moon. The light that does manage to strike the surface of the moon is then reflected back to us at night. We experience that light as one of the phases of the moon. Right? So that's like the scientific explanation, right? Explaining the phases of the moon based on a contingent thing, which is the sun and the orbit of the sun and the moon and the earth, right? All orbiting around each other. But he goes further, right? As Muslims, we're thinking beyond what is customarily normal in nature, right? What is beyond? Why does the moon do that? Why does the sun rotate? Why does the sun orbit? Why does the moon? Why do all these things function the way that they do, right? Beyond, so that's why when people try to say, like atheists and and modern academia, they're like, science proves God doesn't exist. No, it doesn't. Right? Science proves how nature works. All science is doing is observing the natural world and telling us this is how the natural world works. Science is an observation of God's power. Right? So for us, it's the complete opposite. Science actually confirms. Right? Let alone say that science doesn't or negates religion. Like, no. Science actually confirms that God exists. To the more you observe the complexity of all this creation, the more you're like, wow. You see the prophetic miracles, the scientific miracles, the Quranic miracles, right? And so by no way does it negate. But let's go back to our lesson. All right, continue with the next paragraph. But why does the earth obstruct the light of the sun? Why doesn't the light of the sun pass right through it like it does with glass? And why does the moon reflect the light of the sun? Why doesn't it just absorb it? Why does the sun shine at all? And why does the moon orbit the earth? Why does the earth orbit the sun? Like, why do all these things work the way they are? The scientific explanation for the phases of the moon raises dozens of other questions. Because all of the things that are used to explain the phases of the moonlight, its production, its absorption, its reflection, suns, planets, moons, and orbits are themselves contingent, and hence need something else to make them the way that they are. How do we feel about what I just read so far? Good? We're okay? Make sense? Yeah, that top part is a little, it's rough, I know. But the bottom part makes it very clear, right? Right, okay, good. Since they themselves need something to make them the way that they are, they cannot be what is making the phases of the moon the way that they are. Rather, the thing that is making them the way that they are is the same thing that is making the phases of the moon the way that they are. To illustrate, he goes again, just kind of further explaining this. By this point, I think everybody got it, but we're just going to read through it real quick. To illustrate, if A depends on B and B depends on C, then B isn't really doing anything at all. A is, in fact, depending on C. B doesn't answer the question, right? If you tell me, right, you're just telling me the middle, right, immediate, right? It's not really answering the question of who's causing this. What made A the way it is? Instead, it just delays the answer by passing the question on to C. You can see that if C itself is contingent, then it isn't doing anything either, right? If A depends on B, B depends on C, and all of them are contingent, who's doing all this, right? It doesn't answer the question, right? And he says, you can also see unless that there is something non-contingent, something necessary that is making everything in the universe the way that it is, none of the contingent things would exist at all because there is nothing real for them to depend on. Did we get that? Huh? Right? If there's no original and all of these things depend on someone, then none of them would really exist. Right? There's nothing they're all depending on. So that is not rational. Doesn't make sense. Right? There has to be the original point of start. The one that made all of this the way that it is. It doesn't make sense otherwise. How are we doing so far? Is this concept clear? Yes. All right? We feel good, confident? All right, good, alhamdulillah. I know the first few chapters are a bit very heavy with this type of rational thinking, so bear with me, inshallah. Here's an example and again, we all know this intuitively, right? But we're just processing it on a more conscious, intellectual, critical level. Here's an illustration. Here's an example to illustrate this idea. Let's say, for example, that your friend Ahmed says that someone is spreading a bad rumor about you. You ask Ahmed where he heard it from, and he tells you that he heard it from Umar. You ask Umar, and he tells you that he heard it from Khalid. You ask Khalid, and he tells you that he heard it from Salman. You ask Salman, and he tells you that he heard it from Yusuf. You ask Yusuf, and he tells you he heard it from Mukhtar. You are now getting tired, right? Oh my God, hey. I just want to know who started it, right? All of you don't matter. Where did all this begin? Would you simply conclude that the chain goes on forever without an end? No, you wouldn't. There must have been someone who independently started the rumor without hearing it from anyone else. If the person didn't exist, then none of your friends would be passing on the rumor because there would be nothing to pass on. Right? We know that intuitively, right? Again, all of this is intuitive. Just as the bad rumor that was being spread about you must originate in someone who started the rumor himself without receiving it from anyone else, the contingent things in the universe must originate in something that made everything in the universe the way that it is without itself being made the way that it is by anything else. Clear? Make sense? Do I need to repeat that? Okay, we can move on. If you're not clear with any of this, please approach me after class. Okay, I'm going to move on. But please, inshallah, I want you guys to bring your questions. I'm available. We can go over this. No question is a bad question, really, especially in this class. Ask, right? Explore, inshallah ta'ala, and I'll do my best to satisfy your questions. That kind of thing is called the necessary being. We have now shown that both of these facts are true. Fact 1, the universe exists contingently. Fact 2, everything that exists contingently needs a necessary being to make it exist. Good? Since these two facts are true, it follows that the universe needs a necessary being to make to make it exist. This is the logical proof for the existence of a necessary being. Remember from chapter 2 that the first fact about God that we need to prove is that He exists necessarily. Right? God exists necessarily. He's independent. Right? He has no cause. He doesn't rely on anyone. He is self-sufficient, subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that is a concept we can't fathom. To be independent, self-sufficient, not rely on any cause, any provider, any maker, any doer. Right? To always have been. That's when the Prophet was questioned. What did he say? Can Allah. They questioned about the first matter of creation. He said, oh, it was Allah. And there was nothing with Him. That's the reality. We can't fathom. And we can prove it rationally that yes, it makes sense. There has to be a creator. But the question gets a bit complex when you're like, well, how did that creator exist? Right? And that's the question you can't answer. You know there has to be. And you know it too. Like it's kind of like a mental trap. You're like, you know there cannot be an infinite number of creators. So there has to be one. But then you also go back and you're like, well, where did that creator come from? Do you see the mental trap? The mind is confusing itself. It's a trap of the mind, right? Where you're like, I know there cannot be an infinite number of creators. There has to be the original creator. And then your mind gets a trap in itself because the mind likes to define things by time. Everything it likes to define by time and space. So then the mind starts thinking, well, where did that creator start? And then you're like, well, there has to be an original creator. And then you're in this loop, right? Trying to figure it out, but you just can't figure it out because it's beyond what is fathomable. A being without a beginning, an independent, self-sufficient being without a beginning. He is Allah Ta'ala, right? And the Messenger ﷺ said, it was Allah. And there was nothing with Him. That we can't fathom. Right? Don't think of Allah Ta'ala as a being that needs or has dependence. No. As a being of space, matter, time? No. Beyond all that. What does that even mean? We can't even fathom. Right? It's not an entity made of space, right? Or time or matter. What is? You can't. And that is why the Prophet said, stop right there. And that's what the Prophet said, we also take what? To reflect on the signs of God. Because when you reflect on the signs of God, you become infatuated with the love of God. Right? You think about just yourself, what Allah has given you, what He bestowed upon you, the heart that beats, the oxygen you breathe in, you know, the organs, your immune system, your brain, your neurology, all of this, your physiology. You think about the sun, the moon, your ability to digest food and use the restroom and think and move and just live and be alive. If that's all you got from life was the experience of being alive, that is one marvel enough of its own to reflect on for eternity. When you reflect on the blessings of Allah, you're overwhelmed by gratitude and by the greatness of Allah Ta'ala. You see? And so the Prophet says, reflect on the signs of God. Don't reflect on the essence of God because that is a reality your mind cannot fathom. Right? And that is another thing, right? What is our mind trying to do when we try to explain this psychologically? Our mind is trying to capture and make sense, because that's what our mind does. Our mind wants to make sense of everything it experiences. And it has a difficulty not being able to make sense of something beyond it. It's the ego, right? The ego wants to be able to explain everything. Right? And the mind has to know, hey, you don't have all the answers. Right? You don't have the answer for this. You don't have the answer for your own soul and your own being. Your own biology, we don't have all the answers. We're not even close. We're not even close to answering all the complexities of biology. All that we know, there's so much more beyond it that we still don't know. Right? And there's no human being that can fathom. That's why if we look at specialists in science, like they specialize in this niche part of the human being, and they have billions of dollars going into this, and even them, they can't, they don't have all the answers, let alone. So they said the only way to really understand the human being is to have some type of supercomputing system that can process all the facts that we have gathered about humanity. And even that, we still are just scratching the surface. Right? So we can't even comprehend ourselves. How dare we attempt to comprehend the reality of Allah Ta'ala? Right? And that is why when we have these thoughts, we stop. We say, Subhanallah, Allah is above any comparison, any imagination, any thought, any perceivable image. He's beyond all that. Subhanallah, right? That's part of Subhanallah, right? To know that God is above any imperfection that we might try to limit him to. Yes, brother, no problem. So does that make sense? Right? So this is just important. I want to just clarify that because that's important. Let's read through this last part briefly, and then we're going to wrap up. He says, the argument from contingency is a Quranic proof, right? This isn't just some rational, philosophical argument, but he's saying this is based on the Quran. He says the argument from contingency isn't a philosophical proof of human beings, that human beings invented on their own. God Most High himself taught it to his messengers and told them to teach it to mankind. That is why again and again the Quran reminds the Meccan polytheists that the idols that they worship are contingent and therefore not worthy of their worship, because they don't actually make anything in the universe the way that it is. It says, for example, those on whom you call apart from God are servants like you. Call them and let them answer you if you speak truly. Right? He said, here's another example. Say, have you considered what you call upon apart from God? Show me what they have created of the earth, or have they a partnership in the heavens? Right? And so here the Quran is challenging the mushrikeen. There's a story, right, of Imran ibn Hussein radiallahu anhu. Imran ibn Hussein, he was a companion that was greeted by the Malaika. A very unique companion radiallahu anhu. His father came to the Prophet ﷺ. And the Prophet ﷺ asked him, how many deities do you have? How many gods do you have? He said 7. He said, which one do you pray to for rain and vegetation and when you're afraid? He said, I pray to Allah, the grand God. Right? And so like this is how intuitive it is. Right? Like all of us know this. There's one creator. But they adopted these deities, and so the Quran is refuting. They're like, what are these idols you're worshiping? They can't do anything. You know they can't do anything. And that's why when you're in extreme need, you only pray to that one God. When you're in the ocean, وَإِذَا غَشِيَهُمْ مَوْجٌ كَذُلَلٍ, and the waves surround you, and you feel helpless, and you know there's no escape, and then you call on Allah alone. You don't call on anyone. You know this. Like you know this rationally, intuitively. Yet, when you return to the land, and you're safe, you start making shirk and associating partners to Allah Ta'ala. Right? So the Quran calls out the mushriks on this constantly, time and time again. There are dozens of other examples like this in the Quran, but even though the Quran urged the polytheists to use their minds and follow rational arguments, they insisted on turning away from reason and uncritically following the customs of their ancestors. And when it is said to them, follow what God has sent down, they say, no, but we will follow such things as we found our fathers doing. What? Even if their fathers didn't use their minds and were not guided? A clear example of the argument from contingency is found in a chapter of the Quran that we have all memorized, Surah Al-Ikhlas. Allah says, قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ. Say, the great matter is that Allah is utterly one. Or say, He is Allah the One. Allahu Samad, Allah is the everlasting refuge, right? And so Allah's the everlasting refuge is what? All creatures are contingent and they depend on Allah, right? Do you guys see that concept there? He did not beget nor was He begotten, and no one resembles Him, right? And so He has no beginning, He is not begotten. He does not beget, meaning there's no equal, right, to Him, and knows no resemblance to Him subhanahu wa ta'ala. This surah was revealed when a group of Meccan polytheists asked the Prophet ﷺ to describe the God that he worshipped. God Most High taught the Prophet ﷺ to respond by saying that he worshipped the necessary being on whom everything in the universe, Allah Samad, right? Everything in the universe, including their contingent idols, depends. This is stated more clearly in the second verse, which is translated above as Allah is the everlasting refuge. The word everlasting refuge, As-Samad, is an idiomatic translation of the Arabic name of God, As-Samad, whose literal meaning is, like there was an author who wrote an entire essay, Yaqeen Institute, if you research, on the name of Allah, As-Samad, an entire essay, article, pages long, on the name and the depth of this name, As-Samad. So if you want to check that out, check that out. But here, inshallah, we'll continue. He said, As-Samad, whose literal meaning is the one who is sought by everything to fulfill its needs, but who himself needs no one. The meaning of this name captures the entire argument from contingency. Everything in the universe is contingent and needs something to make it the way that it is, and the one who made everything the way that it is itself cannot itself have that need. Sorry. And the one who made everything the way that it is cannot itself have that need. The one who is like that is God. That is exactly what the name As-Samad means. The rest of this chapter emphasizes God's necessary existence. Scholars have explained that the utter oneness that is mentioned in the first verse includes the fact that God is not composed of parts like the polytheist contingent idols. In other words, the reference to His not being begotten in the third verse affirms that His existence doesn't need to be explained by anything else. Again, unlike the polytheist idols who had consorts and children, right? They had spouses and children. And the references to His not begetting and His being different from everything else emphasize the fact that He doesn't have any of the contingent characteristics of anything in the universe, because He doesn't need anyone to make Him the way that He is. This might be the first time you are learning about the concept of contingency, but hopefully you can now see that it is not a new concept at all. It describes a feature of everything in the universe that you already know about before you read this chapter. What this chapter has done is to teach you the significance of this concept. You can now see the contingency of the universe is clear evidence for the existence of God, i.e., a necessary being who doesn't need anything. That is the end of chapter 3. We ask Allah to grant us understanding, increase us in knowledge, grant us conviction, and benefit us by what He has taught us. Allahumma ameen. Wa jazakumullah khair. I'll take maybe 2 questions before we wrap up. I know that was a lot of content. Do we have any questions? If everybody's like, I got this, makes sense, clear, alhamdulillah, we can move on. Any questions? Anything needs clarity?